evening, everyone. Nice to see you all here on a lovely Minnesota winter evening, almost spring. My name is Barbara Fry, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program in the Institute for Global Studies here on campus. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the Human Rights Program and on behalf of Alejandro Baer, the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, to welcome you all here to the inaugural address of our symposium on past, contested, present, social memories and human rights in post-communist Europe. This is an idea that grows out of a 2-year collaborative that has been funded by the Institute for Advanced Study at the university to allow us to approach collective memory and human rights in post-conflict, post-atrocity situations through an interdisciplinary lens. We've had, last year we had a wonderful series of speakers on the region of Latin America and Spain. And this year we're complementing the knowledge that we learned from that experience by bringing together a wonderful group of scholars to help us to understand the experience in post-communist Europe, which brings many differences, some similarities, but many differences to the Latin America experience. My job is to just welcome you here, thank our sponsors, co-sponsors for this series of events, which include the Institute for Advanced Study, the Institute for Global Studies, the Center for Austrian Studies, Department of Political Science, Department of History, Center for Jewish Studies, European Studies Consortium, and the Ohanessian Endowment Fund for Justice and Peace Studies of the Minneapolis Foundation. I would also like to thank Fern Badson and Anita Kunin, who are here, who have been tremendous supporters of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and its various activities and fellowships. I also want to let you know that after tonight's lecture, there will be a reception. Come get a little bit of dessert. I'm told it's outdoors and to the right, not just immediately here, but in the gallery just beyond the lobby. And we will have materials that will give you information about upcoming programs related both to this collaborative, but also to the human rights and Holocaust and genocide studies programs that are coming up that we'd like you to attend. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Evelyn Davidizer, who is the director of the Institute for Global Studies, who will be introducing tonight's keynote speaker.
Thanks, Barb. I said I wasn't going to do thank yous, but I would like to thank Barb Fry and Alejandro Baer for organizing this conference, and the Institute for Advanced Studies, Jennifer, for supporting the collaborative centers that are on the IGS platform, but have been really the beneficiaries of IAS during the last 2 years. So thank you all very much. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, John Paul Himka, who's a professor of history at the University of Alberta. We're very fortunate to have him as the keynote for this evening and to kick off the conference, Contested Past, Contested Present, Social Memories and Human Rights in Post-Communist Europe. Professor Himka is a distinguished scholar of Ukrainian history. He holds a BA in Byzantine and Slavonic Studies from the University of Michigan, where he also earned a PhD in history. He has spent most of his professional life at the University of Alberta, but he has had visiting appointments at Harvard University, Ivano-Franko University in Lviv, Ukraine, and at the Lviv Theological Academy. His professional activities underscore his deep commitment to the field of Ukrainian history. He has served as the director of the research program on religion and culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, as the Canadian representative to the International Association of Ukrainian Studies, and on the editorial board of the Journal of Ukrainian Studies as well. A little bit closer to home, we've been lucky to have him on the editorial board of the Austrian History Yearbook. So the University of Minnesota, which comes out of the University of Minnesota, our Center for Austrian Studies, so we've benefited from his insight and service as well. Professor Himka is a prolific author. His books include Last Judgment, Iconography in the Carpathians, Religion and Nationality in Western Ukraine, Greek Catholic Church and the Ruthenian National Movement in Galicia, 1867 to 1900, Galician Villagers and the Ukrainian National Movement in the 19th century, and Socialism in Galicia, the emergence of Polish social democracy and Ukrainian radicalism, 1860 to 1890. He has a current project that I found quite intriguing, entitled Sanctuary, the Spiritual Heritage Documentation Project, which is a massive digitization effort to create a database of Ukrainian churches and related institutions in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. He is also working on a monograph tentatively titled Ukrainian Nationalists in the Holocaust, Pogroms, Policy, and National Insurgency. And all this while he's getting ready to retire, or semi-retired, so pretty committed in his scholarly work. This evening, his talk, Bringing the Past Back to Light, the Reception of the Holocaust in Post-Communist Europe, captures work in his 2013 volume by the same name, which we happen to have a few copies of if you're interested afterwards. I read his chapter in this book in preparation for this evening's event, and I found it truly fascinating. His scholarship, I think, really emphasizes not just the complexities of history, but perhaps more importantly, the complexities of the historiography of these times and the political implications of that historiography. The sophisticated and nuanced approach, I think, makes him really the perfect keynote speaker to kick off the conference. Let's see, before we proceed, I would like to let everyone know he will also be speaking tomorrow as part of the conference at 4 o'clock, and that session will be in room 1210 of Heller Hall on the West Bank. But this evening we can enjoy him here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Himka.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I also brought a copy of our book. It's Johanna Miklitz and I put it together. It ended up being 800 pages, and federal regulations don't allow more than 3 copies to be brought on an aircraft. But I have those 3 copies. It's 800 pages, but only $50, so that's because my co-editor got a grant from the Claims Conference and other things to subsidize the publication. Joanna and I, we were working on questions of how the legacy of the Holocaust is being treated in contemporary Ukraine, contemporary Poland. It's post-communist Ukraine, contemporary post-communist Poland. And we had students and acquaintances who worked on similar problems in Moldova and in Slovakia. And one day we're walking and we said, we should do this. We should get everybody together and we should write a comprehensive history of how the Holocaust has been dealt with in post-communist countries. And we found authors for every country. And you'll find an essay in there on every single post-communist country, Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, all the way through to Ukraine. And we gave them a list of things we'd like them to cover, so that gives a uniformity to a collected volume, which is very rare. It's a lot of work. I don't expect anybody to read it from cover to cover, although I did meet such a gentleman recently. But what I'd like to do now, what I'd like to do for my talk, is share with you some of the insights we gleaned, some of the lessons we drew from working on this topic. And I'm going to look at 7 characteristic features, I think, of the way the Holocaust is understood in post-communist Europe. And it varies from country to country. I would say these are like 7 elements or seven things that are important. Some countries display the problem more, some less. But I'll start with this. First of all, post-communist Europe is precisely the region where the Holocaust took place. And again, I say there's a range. Estonia, Albania were marginal to the Holocaust. But countries like Romania, countries like Poland, and countries like Ukraine were the major sites of the killing of the Jews. And probably it's a little known fact, you can find it though in my contribution, that 1/4 of the Holocaust victims came from the territory of what today constitutes Ukraine. 1.5 million people. And of course, Poland was another major site, as Romania. So this is the place where it actually happened, what's today post-communist Europe. The Holocaust there was very visible. First of all, the death camps, of course, were located in Poland, so people knew about those. Many concentration labor camps were also located there. But in much of the region, people, the Jewish people were not murdered in faraway death camps, but in fact were marched through the streets, gathered in school sports fields, and then marched out to the cemetery and murdered. So right before people's eyes. You could be in class in elementary school and watch the Jews walk by. 33,000 Jews walked through the city of Kiev on their way to their death in Babi Yar, just in 2 days. The victims were not the Jews, but they were people you knew. Yitzhak Stern or this guy or whatever. Yitzhak Stern, I think, is actually a character in Schindler's List. But they were people you knew. It was very intimate. But even though it happened there, perhaps because it happened there, this is not where the idea of the Holocaust as a major moral touchstone developed. It's in fact preeminently in the United States, I would say, where the idea that, but also in Sweden to a certain extent, and Germany has this contribution. But when you think of the great impact of the 1979 miniseries, The Holocaust, it really was a game changer in terms of American consciousness about the Holocaust. And it became something we as Americans could feel very proud of, that we didn't do this, other people did it. And it's so much easier to insist on the enormity and importance of a crime that you had no part in than it is when it happened in your backyard and the genocidal machinery was unleashed there where you live. And I think it's I don't want to get polemical, but I do think it's characteristic of the attitude that you can have a Holocaust museum, an excellent one in Washington, D.C., right on the mall, but it's been impossible to get a museum of slavery. So, this has been made by critics before, but the point I want to point to is a certain moral comfort that we have, and many East Europeans may not have, about the Holocaust. Even in Western Europe, the Holocaust looked different. Jewish victims were deported to be moved elsewhere, and usually in Eastern Europe, in Poland. So there's a difference in perspective of something that happened here, that every people were intimately knew, and where it is a very theoretical Schindler's List kind of story, demons and angels. Second insight, or thing that has to be taken into account, is that there were huge benefits for individuals, regimes, and nations in the regions where the Holocaust took place. So the first step, I would say, of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe is the beginning of the Soviet-German War. The Germans invade in June of 1941, invade the Soviet Union. And this unleashes a wave of pogroms in the summer of 1941. Maybe you've read Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, to see what a pogrom looked like in Jedwabne. And in these, masses of the population took part. Beating Jews, but stealing was probably the major thing that happens during a pogrom. In a pogrom, like these in the summer of 41, peasants would come down with empty carts, load them up with goods. People would run out of the Jewish houses with pillowcases, silver, whatever they could find. And this was an immediate transfer of wealth right at the beginning of the war, when economic stability was very important, even for Jews. One of the greatest ways to survive was to have money. Those Jews who had money and they had gold or they had jewelry, it was easier for them to bribe this police official, bribe that person. And every time, like if you study in detail these roundups of the Jews in the first few roundups in these East European cities, very often the police are being bribed, and the poor are the ones who are being taken for murder. So that I want to show you the importance of money and jewelry and things like that at this moment. Then there was trade with persecuted Jews. If the Jews had like earrings, or if they had gold, or they had foreign currency, or they had something valuable, but they lacked potatoes, they lacked bread, then it was not exactly a fair trade that occurred, but people could gain furs and all these other things with a bag of potatoes. I read an account, I spoke to a man who was in the town of Croatia in Ukraine, and a bunch of Hungarian Jews were pushed out of Hungary because the Hungarians didn't want all their Jews, pushed them into this area around Croatia, and all the people descended on these Hungarian Jews to trade with them, because they had been under Soviet rule for a year and a half. The stores were empty. There was nothing to buy. And here these Jews from rich Hungary, capitalist Hungary, came with suitcases full of stuff. But you could get a fur coat for a bag of potatoes. So this was a transfer of wealth also for individuals. Then it was a very commonplace for Jews to find a trusted Gentile and give them property. Whether it be riches, so that they weren't strip searched and these riches would be taken away from them, or your cows or something like that would be given to a local Gentile. And some people felt it was an advantage when their Jews were murdered, because then they inherited this property legally. And there were cases where people killed the Jews who gave them property to hold on to, because they were envious of that property. There's a very powerful Polish film from 1991 by Paweł Łyziński called Birthplace, Miejsce Rodzenia, which has a case where a Polish-American, Henryk Greenberg, goes back to Poland to the little village where his father was murdered, and it turns out he has to long time talking to villagers before it comes out, but everybody knew the story. His father had left 2 milk cows. He was a dairyman. He had left 2 milk cows with a Polish farmer, and the Polish farmer, and he would come and he would get milk for his family who was in hiding, and the Polish farmer eventually killed him with an axe so that he could keep the cows. So this kind of thing goes on. When there was an action, which means that the Jews would be rounded up and taken for execution or transport to a death camp, those houses they had in the village were then shared out among the population. So my supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, he lived in a Polish village in World War II, and he remembers that the Polish people knew when the Action was going to be. They knew that the Jews were about to be removed because there were Polish police, so-called blue police, or Policja Granatowa. And they were aware, so what they did is they met, divided the houses among themselves before the Jews were gone, and ordered a priest already, before they were gone, to come and bless the homes and turn them from Jewish homes into Christian homes. So, and don't forget, they made up about 10% of the population in these regions. So there was a share of wealth that went to them. Jewish enterprises were Aryanized. This is dramatized in this film, Shop on Main Street, for example, the Slovak film, very, very, very powerful film. Jewish enterprises were Aryanized. My late father-in-law ran a Ukrainian newspaper in Krakow. He got it from an Aryanized Jewish printing press, as they got it from an Aryanized apartment. The Ukrainian cooperative movement flourished during World War II. Why? No Jewish competitors, all their goods would be taken over. Very important, apartments in cities. This was important for individuals and for changing the character of the towns and cities. Like Western Ukrainian and Polish cities, the bigger cities would have like 1/3 Jewish population. Smaller towns, like they call them shtetl, but they would be mixed population really. Might have half to 3/4 of the population being Jewish. And when they were removed by the Holocaust, all those apartments became available. All those apartments became available. Well, it's tremendous social advancement for rural and small town people. Now in Western Ukraine, this was even more the case because the Poles, who made up another large proportion of the people in the cities, were also expelled later by the Soviets. But the Jews were and their apartments became open, and it allowed for large-scale social advancement. So my family in Ukraine, a number of them moved from the village where they had been peasants from time immemorial. The Soviets gave them a certain education, and were able to house them now in the city because they were empty apartments. The demography changed. Kiev after the war, many Jews went into exile, hiding, evacuation in the east during the war, removed from where the Germans could get at them. Well, those who were living in the meantime in Jewish apartments, if those were Jewish apartments where the Jews had been murdered, there was no problem. But if the Jews came back from exile and tried to get their apartments back, then there was a real problem. And there were, in fact, riots in Kiev for a few days over returning Jews getting their apartments. My point is that when we look at the Holocaust, which was not undertaken for economic reasons, a lot of people, one way or another, benefited from it in a way which as we do more research, we understand was quite across the board. Number 3, people, but of course not all people, participated in the Holocaust one way or another. First, I've already mentioned the wave of pogroms in the summer of 1941. People of all classes participated in this. We have school principals, we have physicians, we know took part in this. We know that we have nationalist activists, we know we have scummy criminal elements taking part, we know we have large numbers of peasants taking part, widespread. And in certain places, like if you read the account of the massacres in Yadvabne and some other accounts, people felt that if they didn't go out and kill Jews, they wouldn't get a right to their apartments and to their houses. So there was that. That was the beginning. Plus, but much more important than that, was that the Germans unleashed a large genocidal machinery which required masses of local personnel to run. I mean, one of the reasons for the invention of the death camps was because it required so few personnel. But most of the Holocaust actually required a lot of people. If you think of the German advance into the Soviet Union during the Second World War, they were understaffed in every respect. They didn't have enough secretaries, they didn't have enough soldiers, they didn't have enough administrators, they didn't have enough people to simply operate the Holocaust. So they were looking for local personnel to help out, and sometimes this was a matter of choice, usually some kind of constrained choice, and sometimes there was not even any choice involved. But let me give you some examples. First, I mentioned nationalist militias. These were people who Himmler was interested in recruiting these people into some kind of local police forces when he had this vision. In July, he realized that you could actually kill a lot of Jews. I mean, we now know that the decision to have the Holocaust, as we refer to it today, was a series of incremental steps. But by July of 1941, it was very clear to Himmler that you could really do a massive job of extermination, or genocidal extermination. And he began building up auxiliary police forces precisely with this aim in mind. I mean, he didn't have enough Germans to police the occupied territory, so the auxiliary police were important for that. But they were also the most important instrument for finding and rounding up the Jews of Eastern Europe. Firemen. Everybody would think, volunteer firemen, what wonderful people. But of course, they were also used all the time in the Holocaust to round people up, to burn buildings down, to fill up barns full of people and to burn them down. These were firemen who did this, local firemen very often. There's an absolutely devastating book that just came out not long ago. Jan Grabowski's book. It came out a little earlier in another language, but in English, it's called The Hunt for the Jews. And what he does is he concentrates on the period after the ghettos are liquidated and Jews are hiding. But he shows to what an extent people were really forced to participate in the Holocaust. So, for instance, municipal officials, like the equivalents of mayors and reeves or whatever you have, local municipal elders, they were not allowed to resign. You had to stay in your place. And you had to follow all the orders that came down from the Germans. So they would say, you have to register your Jews, or you have to prevent them from going out at night, or you have to impose a curfew, or whatever, and they just had no choice but to follow these rules. The Baudienst. In parts of Poland, every 20-year-old male had to join a sort of a construction group called the Baudienst. They did outdoor work, road work, stuff like that. And they were also obliged to help in the Holocaust, to round up Jews and to kill them sometimes in the course of rounding them up. Now these are 20-year-old boys, so they did it, with a lot of gusto. But they also didn't have much choice. There were hostages in a village. The normal thing in a village would there be 20 people responsible to make sure that German Jewish policy was followed. So this is after the liquidation of the ghettos. If you had a village was supposed to have a watch on at the night, and if Jews were coming near the village, they were to be apprehended. If Jews were found in the village, those 20 hostages would be murdered. So large numbers of people were recruited just ex officio from their being 20 years old, or being the elder in the town, or being prominent enough to be listed as a hostage, and where you had to take part in these procedures. Father Patrick Dubois has been crisscrossing Ukraine, Belarus, in other regions and looking for bystanders in their stories, so-called bystanders. And he wrote this book, Holocaust by Bullets, and it's a series of interviews. And from that we get a much clearer picture of how these work. Now we know that most of the shooters of the Jews, and most of the Jews in Ukraine and parts of Poland, large parts of them were actually shot rather than taken to death camps. There was a small group of professionals, the so-called Einsatz group, which went from place to place. They were sort of like mobile killing units that went around and killed local Jewish populations. But when they did that, they had requisition other people to help them out. So somebody had to cook for them. So somebody cooked for the executioners. One little girl was made to tramp down the dirt on the graves so that so that they could get more dirt on and bury these Jews. Boys could be given they didn't finish shooting everybody in a day, so the rest were herded into a barn, and a local boy was given a gun and told, "You watch these Jews, make sure not one escapes or you're dead in the morning." You know, a lot of just sort of ad hoc impressment of the population into it. You really can't have any kind of mass killing without a lot of extra help. And while it's very hard for us in non-genocidal societies to realize that, it's just like, I'm not going to debate whether it's a genocide or not a genocide, but you take the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33. And a lot of the people who enforced that, who took food away from starving peasants, were their neighbors. People of the exact, because you can't have these things go on without help. And number 4, there were important national alliances with the Nazis, which complicate the attitude to the Holocaust. So, for instance, the Germans created 2 states which had never existed before in Europe: Slovakia and Croatia. And both of them were quite grateful to the Germans and got more or less on board on their program. Slovakia was headed by a Catholic priest, Monsignor Josef Tiso, but it was enough of an ally of the Germans in this procedure that they paid for the Jews' deportation and destruction per head. I actually forget the amount, but they paid the German government for transport and removal to a camp. So they were, that was a new state. Croatia, which also appeared for maybe not the first time in history, because it was sort of like medieval, early modern incarnations of it. But it had its own combination, concentration, and death camp, where they killed Serbs and Jews and others. So, and when people in Eastern Europe look back, in these countries, they can see that their independence was linked with the German era, and they got comfortable, with the idea that their leaders did what they did during the war. Tendency to denial. There were states allied with Germany in the Second World War. Hungary, Romania were both allied with Germany, and both of them. One were Hungary with much more reluctance and less efficiency. Involved in the Holocaust. But Romania is one of the few places where we actually have the leader saying, "Let's kill all these Jews," and we have it on records of his meetings. And we don't even have Hitler saying that. Then there were state-seeking nationalist movements, like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the Lithuanian Activist Front, which cooperated in various anti-Semitic and Holocaust activities against seeking German approbation and alliance for the emergence of their own states, or restoration of their state in the case of Lithuania. So all this complicates the attitude towards the Holocaust. And there are exceptions too, like notably Poland, where there just was no room for an alliance with the Nazis, because the Nazis were very anti-Polish. And number 5 point very important in understanding the East European attitude towards the Holocaust, or the post-communist Europe's attitude towards the Holocaust, is the legacy of communism, which has a lot of aspects to it. Under communism, the Holocaust was never singled out in the way it was in the West. It was subsumed into a narrative about peaceful civilians murdered by fascists. So in Soviet documents, right after the war, you will find peaceful Soviet citizens killed by fascists. And the peaceful Soviet citizens is always a code word for Jews. But the particularity of Jewish suffering was little emphasized. Yugoslavia, which had its own issues, it was a communist country that had its own issues, but one of them was to have an idea of the collective suffering of the Yugoslav people. They didn't want to bring the Jews out in any particularity. Similarly, the Soviets didn't want to, for them, the Russians, the Soviet people as such, particularly the Russians were the great heroes of the war, no reason to talk about any particular suffering of the Jews. So for East European post-communist countries, when the walls collapse and communism falls in 1989, it rather comes to them as a surprise that this becomes all of a sudden a big issue. Why is it a big issue? Never was a big issue before. And there's a very intelligent article by Tariq Siril Aman in a recent issue, a book published by Critica Press, where he makes the point that there was an imperfect silence about the Holocaust in communist countries. Particularly it had the Soviet Union in mind. Was that you knew enough to know that Jews were killed. It wasn't emphasized, but any intelligent reading would do that. But nothing about it was particularly exceptional. And whatever your grandfather did or your father did or you did on the Jewish question really it's not a major issue. It's just not, wasn't that important. And I've run into this too, and one of the things in the course of my research on these topics is I inherited the files of a Ukrainian-Canadian communist, Peter Kravchuk. And the Soviet authorities had entrusted him with writing pamphlets against Ukrainian nationalists and revealing how evil they were, involvement in the Holocaust and all that. What was interesting to me, absolutely fascinating, was that the Soviets who sent these documents seemed to not get it at all. They didn't seem to understand at all that the Holocaust was what the issue was, and that if they wanted to make inroads into American understanding of the nationalists, then they had to emphasize the Holocaust. That was sort of their intention. But they didn't understand it. So instead, most of the documents he got would say, well, this unit swore an oath to Adolf Hitler, these people swore allegiance to the Reich, and they could understand treason, but they couldn't actually get their minds around the idea of the Holocaust. They didn't understand it. And this made people, I think, rather comfortable with whatever happened in the past. This idea that there was nothing particularly to be worried about here, even though, as I've just explained, lots of people benefited from this where the Holocaust occurred. A lot of people even participated in the Holocaust. But the legacy of communism also influenced it because of a certain problem with comparative or particularly competitive suffering. So you have the Ukrainians with their famine of 1932-33. How do their sufferings relate to the Jewish sufferings? and there's been some really nasty competitive sort of, you had 6 million, we had 7 to 10 million. You were lucky, you went to gas chambers and it was over quick. We starved. It's pretty disgusting. But there were real tragedies experienced by people under communism. Persecution of the Poles in the USSR, deportations in the Baltic states, many the terror of 1937. How do you? It's always a sensitive topic. How do you deal with atrocities committed in the same place by two regimes? Timothy Snyder wrote the book Bloodlands, in which he tried to deal with this topic, but he met with a lot of criticism for his work, and it's just very hard to know what to do about communist suffering when you have the Holocaust, or how do you deal with the Holocaust when you want to emphasize lack of freedom of speech or other things that occurred under communism. And sometimes the anti-communist legacy, because the revolt of 1989 in the early 90s was an anti-communist revolt, makes memory allies with figures who were implicated in the Holocaust. So that in Slovakia today, a lot of people feel there should be statues to Monsignor Tiso, who of course was the guy who was paying the Germans to get rid of his Jews. Or Admiral Horthy, who ruled over wartime Hungary. Marshal Antonescu, responsible for the murders of hundreds of thousands of Jews that he ordered. The organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which was also implicated in the Holocaust. But these were all also anti-communist figures who represented an anti-Soviet national past, and so it's difficult to have on these heroes of the national past the taint which we associate with the Holocaust. My sixth point, a lot of lingering anti-Semitic tropes in this part of Europe. For one thing, there were few Jews left in this part of the world after the Holocaust. At one point, the number of Jews in Poland must have been down to 3,000 to 5,000. One time that was there were I don't know, many hundreds of thousands of Jews in Poland. There were few Jews left here after the Holocaust. Most of them were killed. And then there were every once in a while these paroxysms of anti-Semitism within the communist regimes. So Stalin's deadly campaign against rootless cosmopolitanism. Rootless cosmopolitans are just simply Jews. Killing of the Jewish, the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist League, persecution of Jewish writers, persecution in the sense of having a bullet in them. Things like the 1968 anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, which drove many people of partial Jewish origin out of the country. Anti-Semitic trials during the anti-Titoist campaigns. Anyways, in these circumstances, with a small, very vulnerable Jewish communities in these countries, they were certainly not able to fight effectively or vocally against anti-Semitic attitudes. And you can compare that to the United States. I mean, there's certainly anti-Semitism also in the United States, among individuals. But with civil rights movement and a number of other sensitivities on these parts, no public official would make an anti-Semitic comment in our country. So, but that's not true over there. It's not true over there. There's just not many Jews left there, and as I say, they're not really in a position to be defending their Jewishness. And you get the revival of, or persistence of stereotypes of Judeo communism, Judeo, which is emphasis on the Jewish role in communist organs of repression. So many NKVD agents were Jewish, or the Polish Stalinist secret police were predominantly Jewish, and all this. So there are more sophisticated empirical versions of this, which actually try to count Jews in the leadership. And even Tim Snyder in Bloodlands does this. And done correctly, this kind of exploration, I think, is valid. Why are there so many Irish policemen in New York at certain times? How do certain groups, ethnic groups, get involved? And it's a complex question. It's an interesting question. And one can explore it. But the nationalist version, first of all, vulgarizes it. So the communists become Jews. And the narrative is the Jews did this to us. And some people say, now we're even. I know that Mati Utila will be talking about the double genocide theory. But my friend Salis Susizelos, who has co-wrote the chapter on Lithuania in our book, a very good specialist on the Lithuanian Holocaust and Lithuanian memory of the Holocaust. He said, the basic double genocide theory is, you did that to us, that is the deportations of 1941, or from 1940, you did that to us, we did that to you. Call it quits. In fact, life is strange, right? But at one time, I ran into and got to know quite well the leading anti-Semite in Ukraine, Vasily Adamenko, who heads up Mao, which I might mention briefly later. But I didn't know he was an anti-Semite. We worked together with something totally different. We became friends. He brought gifts for the family and so on. And we met in Prague in 1986, and he mentioned something about Ukrainians participating in the Holocaust in Ukraine. And I said, Vasil, but is this true? Did they really? I was very, very ignorant. Did they really do this? And he says, of course they did that. I says, well, why? He says, well, because the Jews organized the famine. And I says, the Jews organized the famine? He says, yes. And that was because we gave them the pogroms of 1919. And for him, it was a very clear story, an interaction between, what the Jews did, what we did, and also. And you might think that this is way off the wall, but it falls into sort of that common beliefs of some people. And an increasingly common trope these days is one I call, we didn't do it, but they certainly deserved what they got. And there's a team of Polish historians. I mean, they're good, very good in many ways, like Bogdan Musał and Marikan Chodekiewicz, and they've done some really good work. But part of what they do is they try to minimize Polish responsibility in the Holocaust. So one of their major focuses is to get rid of the story that Jan Gross tells about Jedwabne, that half of the Polish Gentiles killed the Polish Jews in Jedwabne. So they bring up all kinds of evidence looking for the Germans involved, and they're trying to minimize Polish, but at the same time also doing a lot of research on Jewish participation in the organs of communist repression. That's what I call, we didn't do it, but they certainly deserved what they got. You can find this regularly in the discourse of Ukrainian diaspora activists. We deny that the nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, had anything to do with the Holocaust. On the other hand, very clear that the Jews were the ones who were in the NKVD and the organs of repression in the 1930s when the Ukrainian movement was being prosecuted. And even when you can point out that the Jews were removed, like one of the stories, 1941, pogroms, they said, well, the Jews were responsible for the communist crimes, and I point out that actually the Jews were removed at that time from the Soviet organs of repression. They had been beginning to be pushed out in 1937. But the guy comes back, he says, but look, they made up such and such a percentage of the, I think it was 2.2, and percentage of the secret police in the region, and they made up 1.1% of the whole Soviet population. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's a ridiculous argument. But he had to insist that the Jews were responsible. And with the war going on in Ukraine right now, some of the thinking gets even more. Ukrainian diaspora activists are one thing. But you have a historian, Igor Hidich, a real historian, genuine historian. He recently wrote a long article which was published in what used to be considered a very liberal historical venue to publish him. But it was an account that indeed the Ukrainian nationalists were not involved in anything against the Jews, but neither were they involved in pogroms in 1919. However, the Jews were involved all that time in communist repressions. So this becomes part now. Okay, it's not a guy in Prague talking to me in 1986. It's a prominent historian writing in a prominent liberal historical venue. This is very different than what we would find here. Jews continue to be stereotyped as powerful and wealthy and able to head conspiracies. So, when the world doesn't work right, guess who's responsible for it? Some influence of Middle Eastern anti-Semitism. Like I mentioned, Yaremenko, the major Ukrainian anti-Semite, he runs a system of public educational institutions, higher educational institutions, actually the biggest one in Ukraine. And he gets his funding from Kuwait and the Middle East, a lot of it. And people from the Middle East are brought in. So there's some modernization of anti-Semitic attitudes going on as well. Building on the lingering anti-Zionist attitudes fostered by the communist states. And the seventh and sort of, I would say, last characteristic of the way the Holocaust is received is that the Holocaust is often appropriated for one's own national purposes. And I should say there's nothing entirely unusual, since Israel, of course, appropriates the Holocaust in favor of its defense of Israel. But it's often used as a card in the conflicts in the region among nationalities. So, Russia, right now, after annexing Crimea and waging a hybrid war in the eastern Ukraine, the continual theme of its propaganda is that these Ukrainians are fascists, and that the nationalists of Ukraine today are no different than the nationalists who were involved in the Holocaust during wartime. So, for example, a television broadcast I watched, they showed horrific pictures from the pogrom in Lviv in July of 1941, which was indeed perpetrated by Ukrainian nationalists, at least in large part. And then they immediately cut to the burning of the building in Odessa, in which some 40 pro-Russian activists were killed in the recent events in Ukraine. And so for them, it's not like they're all sort of really sad about what happened to East European Jewry, but what they want to do is pin the Holocaust on their political enemies. During the wars of the Yugoslav succession, Serbs just, they came out with all this stuff about Jews and Serbs, we understand each other, we've been persecuted together. And you know who does a lot of that persecution? It's the Croats. We died together in the camps at Jasenovac. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. The Holocaust again expropriated. Or expropriated just for national pride, like the Albanians and Bulgarians are quite convinced that they didn't do anything wrong during this period, and in fact were the major saviors of Jews. This means being blind to certain things, particularly in the case of the Albanians, who don't want to see that they had a Hanjara unit, which actually, there was a unit of theirs which was involved in the Holocaust, and that the Bulgarians tried to sort of forget what they did in Macedonia. those kind of things happen. But nonetheless, they become sort of like a Danish story. It's amazing how wonderful we are. You can find this, kind of stuff. Everybody else was killing their Jews. We always loved them. Building their reputation on it. Or just simple instrumentalization of the Holocaust to make your own point about your own suffering. So we saw that during the wars of Yugoslav succession, when in fact Bosnian Muslims frequently resorted to Holocaust tropes, pictures that more or less imitated a very famous picture of prisoners in Auschwitz, but these were prisoners of Bosnian Muslims, saying it's happening here. So the appropriation for one's own national purposes in conflict situations is quite common. So those are my 7 larger insights. Now just have a few parting thoughts. And I think that the legacy of the Holocaust remains a problematic issue over there. Certainly it has its repercussions in politics to this day. I mean, the Russian campaign against the Euromaidan, against the Ukrainians, is definitely raking up memory of the Holocaust. Slovakia would really like to be able to recognize its wartime independent state and its leader, Monsignor Tiso, as legitimate heroes. So they still play in, and conservative political parties like Fidesz in Hungary are able also to use these kind of simplified nationalist versions that eliminate the Holocaust from their consciousness. So it plays a role by presence and absence in post-communist Europe's politics. It plays a role in culture. Sometimes it's just remarkable because of its absence. So Ukraine, which is my area of specialty, has yet to have ever had a feature film about the Holocaust. It's had a half-hour documentary produced by Steven Spielberg and the Ukrainian oligarch Viktor Pinchuk. But aside from that, it's nowhere. Novels about the Holocaust, I don't know them. Except, crazy ones where Ukrainian nationalists are rescuers of Jews occasionally. But otherwise, no. It's different in different countries. Poland has a really rich legacy of very, very interesting Holocaust films, going back quite early to the 50s at least. And even today, like Ida or Ida in a major film comes out. And then there's that very interesting ambivalence of Czech cinema, which I don't know if you've ever seen. There's some great Czech films, of course. And so I tend to watch as many as I can see. So there's Jan Hřebejk in 2000 put out a film called Divided We Fall. And this is a story, a Holocaust story, about a sort of ordinary schlep, or ordinary guy, who ends up hiding a Jew, partially out of just the goodness of his heart. He's got a neighbor who's actually signed up as a German and is sort of inspecting and may know about this Jew. And it's tense relations. It's actually a comedy, though. It's a comedy. At the end of the film, though, everybody is redeemed. The guy who was the German sort of official, he turns out to be a good guy, too. The person who was in the Czech resistance turns out to have been an anti-Semite who almost got this Jew that the hero was hiding arrested. And in the end, we're all okay. You're okay, I'm okay, kind of thing. And the same thing is another very interesting Czech film, wonderful film, Jiří Menzel, closely watched Trains fame, right? I Served the King of England came out in 2006. And in this, and a guy Aryanizes basically an inn, and gets very deeply involved with a Nazi woman. But in the end of the film, he's sitting there, it's all over, that's a long time ago. He sits up, he has a beer in the tavern, and he thinks about the former owner, and he sort of appears in an apparition and is sitting there with him. He's okay too. So it's very interesting. This need to go beyond trauma. Interesting case too is scholarship. Again, Poland stands apart from many other places in Eastern Europe in the kind of excellent Holocaust scholarship carried on at a high level in Poland itself. And Ukraine, where really I would say there is one Holocaust scholar who writes in a sort of open, critical way, informed by World Holocaust studies. But most of the time he's outside. Last time I saw him was in Israel. He Skyped me yesterday from Toronto. That kind of Ukrainian scholar. But actually the best work on the Holocaust in the region is done by scholars in North America and Western Europe. And often, but not entirely, because the Germans have done fantastic work, but often scholars who left the countries on which they write. So Radu Ioanni came from Romania. He writes on Romania but lives in Washington. Jan Gross comes from Poland, writes in New York. Jan Grabowski, this wonderful author, lives in Ottawa, but comes from Poland. So very often people from these places, or of those heritages, are the ones who are able to do it. But only the sort of air of North America makes it kind of possible. But I think if we think a bit more deeply about all these kind of complexes I've identified, and this was one of the really interesting things about this work, was that these complexes began to jump up at you, these kind of ways of looking at the world so radically different than their own. But you also wonder, when you think about this a bit more deeply, we wonder if these complexes are also not partly reflections of some of our own complexes around memory and atrocity, which are unresolved and push themselves in directions that we don't even ourselves understand. So I thank you for your attention and willing to answer any questions that I can.